Okay, we were in lesson 6.08 and we had left off on the Missouri Compromise, right here on page 396. In turn, hardline anti-slavery congressmen viewed the proposed compromise as caving into the South. In a dramatic speech, Senator William Henry Seward proclaimed that there was a higher law than the Constitution. The Constitution might sanction slavery, he implied, but God did not. While Calhoun and Seward held on to their extremes, most congressmen preferred compromise. Daniel Webster gave a rousing speech in favor of Clay's proposal. I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American, he had proclaimed. I speak for the preservation of the Union. Webster's anti-slavery friends in the North labeled him as a traitor to the cause, but most Americans agreed with Webster, who wanted at all costs to avoid a civil war. When Henry Clay was unable to secure passage of his bill, a younger colleague, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, broke it into smaller parts and drove it through the Senate piece by piece. In the end, no one was particularly happy with the outcome, but most Americans expressed relief that the slavery issue had been resolved. Calhoun died before the Compromise of 1850 won final passage. Within 2 years, Clay and Webster would also pass away. Their exit from the political stage helped usher in a new era of American politics. So let's go back here to this other page and look at the map from the Compromise of 1850. So here's this line of latitude, this red line. That was the Missouri Compromise Law. And that was organized after the Louisiana Purchase to deal with the new lands that was brought forth after the Louisiana Purchase, here in this light blue, where it says unorganized territory. However, the problem was that this line only went so far here. It didn't go any farther west because the United States didn't have this land at the time of the Missouri Compromise. But now they had this land and they had to decide, would that line keep going over or what were they going to do? And that's why they had to come up with the idea of the Missouri Compromise, and all the measures of the Missouri Compromise were listed there. Okay, let's see. Whoa, I think I went too far. Did I go too far? Yes, I did. The winds of political change. Through the 1830s and 1840s, American politics have been dominated by two political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. These parties disagreed on many things, including banks, tariffs, internal improvements, and working men's rights. By the late 1840s, many of the old disagreements were settled. Andrew Jackson had killed the National Bank, and few people believed a new one would ever rise in its place. Most people now accepted some federal government role in building roads, bridges, and railroads. The two sides continued to argue about tariffs, but that issue, like the others, would soon be overshadowed by slavery. The Free Soil Party. And it wasn't about giving away soil, giving away dirt. It's going to be free states, not slave. With the old issues no longer front and center, the parties began to lose their support. In the North, the Whigs split into two factions: Cotton Whigs, who favored close political and economic ties between Northern businesses and Southern plantation owners, and Conscience Whigs, who were strongly opposed to the spread of slavery. Disagreements over slavery also divided the Democrats. A group of Northern Democrats called the Barn Burners split from the Democratic Party. They took their name from an old Dutch folktale about a farmer who burned down his barn in order to get rid of rats. Former President Martin Van Buren and his followers decided the only way to rid the Democrat Party of its attachment to slavery was, in effect, to burn the party down. In 1848, the Barn Burners left the Democratic Party and joined a group of Conscience Whigs and formed the new Free Soil Party. The Free Soilers promised to stop the spread of slavery into new territories. They nominated Van Buren as their presidential candidate. Van Buren lost. By the time of the next presidential election in 1852, most Conscience Whigs and Barn Burners had returned to their original parties, but it was clear that old party allegiances could be broken down by sectional politics. The Fugitive Slave Act. When the Compromise of 1850 was passed, it included a new Fugitive Slave Act. The act denied runaway slaves the right to a jury trial and required local law enforcement officials to assist in the arrest and recovery of fugitives. Refusal to cooperate could result in a steep fine. In addition, anyone found actively harboring a fugitive slave could be fined or imprisoned up to 6 months. In effect, if a slave owner showed up in a northern town and identified a person as a runaway slave, then the local police were compelled to arrest the black man or woman with no questions asked. There was no system of checks to ensure the free blacks would not be wrongfully taken into slavery. By the 1850s, many people believed that any slave who managed to escape to free soil should be considered emancipated, which means free. But the Fugitive Slave Act denied freedom to escape slaves. The law angered many Northerners who felt it required them to protect a system they condemned. In several cases, entire towns rebelled against the new law. In 1854, a Virginia planter traveled to Boston to claim repossession of his runaway slave. When federal marshals arrested Burns, a citizens' committee convened at Faneuil Hall and determined to liberate him. Declaring that resistance to tyrants is obedience to God, they armed themselves with axes and pistols and stormed the courthouse. A gunfight followed, and a federal lawman was killed. In response, the new president, Franklin Pierce, a Northern Democrat in support of slavery, ordered the United States military to escort Burns to a Navy ship for transport back to Virginia. As the troops marched the runway down the streets of Boston, the church bells tolled. Angry citizens hung their American flags upside down in protest. One Bostonian recalled, "When it was all over and I was left alone in my office, I just put my face in my hands and wept." In 1854, many Northerners had had enough. A cotton Whig spoke for many of his townsmen when he wrote, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and woke up stark mad abolitionists." Harriet Beecher Stowe humanizes slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of Lyman Beecher, a well-known New England clergyman active in many antebellum reform movements. Stowe was driven by deep religious conviction that slavery was morally wrong. She was outraged by the Fugitive Slave Act, which she called an abomination. Sorry. In 1851, she began writing a book to expose the horrors of slavery. The chapters were first published in an abolitionist newspaper. In 1852, Stowe published her stories as a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book sold more than 300,000 copies in its first year of publication. Translated into many languages, it went on to sell more than 4 million copies worldwide by 1861. From her quiet life in Maine, Stowe was thrust center stage as an overnight hero of the abolitionist movement. Southerners were outraged by Stowe's writings and insisted she had exaggerated the brutality of their labor system. With its vivid portrayals of the evil slave master, Simon Legree, and the kind-hearted slave, Eliza and Uncle Tom, the novel is a powerful piece of anti-slavery propaganda. For millions of readers, it transformed slavery from an abstract issue to a vivid picture of human suffering. That's a name to remember, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. And here is an excerpt from Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can read that at your own leisure, but I'm going to skip on, go back to the textbook reading. And the Bleeding Kansas. We're going to have to read about another compromise called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We have Nebraska territory here and Kansas territory here. And we're going to read about what's happening there. Despite widespread Northern opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act, the Compromise of 1850 was reasonably successful at quieting the disagreement between North and South. Then Stephen Douglas came along. Douglas was a skilled politician who had shepherded Henry Clay's compromise through the Senate in 1850, but in 1854 he committed an enormous political error. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. As a Midwesterner, Douglas was eager to build a transcontinental railroad line that would help spur the economic development of areas like his home state of Illinois. But no such railroad could be constructed until the vast unsettled Kansas and Nebraska territories were officially organized. As a rule, unsettled territories needed to be organized, meaning they needed to set up territorial governments after which they could petition for statehood. As chairman of the Senate committee responsible for the Western Territories, Douglas introduced a bill to organize Kansas and Nebraska. Both territories were part of the Louisiana Purchase, and both lay above the 36-degree parallel. Southerners were not prepared to introduce two new free states, which would give the advantage to the North in the Senate. To satisfy his Southern colleagues, Douglas inserted a provision in his bill calling for popular sovereignty, that is, letting the people decide. This provision said the residents of Kansas and Nebraska could decide for themselves whether to permit slavery in the newly organized territories. That's popular sovereignty. With support from Southern Whigs, Southern Democrats, and a few Northern Democrats, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. And I'll go back to the map shortly. Douglas knew that the popular sovereignty provision would, as he put it, raise a hell of a storm, but he may have underestimated just how quickly that storm would become a political tornado. By passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas and his colleagues had effectively abandoned the Missouri Compromise and thrown fuel on the smoldering slavery question. Violence in Kansas. After the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Southerners and Northerners flooded into Kansas by the thousands. Speaking for the Free Soilers, remember, people who wanted it to be a free state, William Seward declared that we will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas. Northern businessmen founded the Massachusetts Emigrant Aid Company, which subsidized New England and Midwestern farmers who were willing to move to the territory. So, trying to sway the votes for anti-slavery. Pro-slavery Senator David Atchison of Missouri pledged the game must be played boldly. If we win, Atchison explained, we will carry slavery to the Pacific Ocean. If we fail, we lose Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and all the territories. In early 1855, anti-slavery settlers made up the majority of Kansas settlers and probably would have won a fair election. Fair election, that is. But Southerners made sure the elections were anything but fair. They used violence, ballot box stuffing, and intimidation to rig a series of territorial elections, making a mockery of the idea of popular sovereignty. Prior to one of the elections, Senator Atchison led an armed band of Missourians into Kansas and promised to kill every darned abolitionist in the territory if need be. By 1856, the situation had grown so dire that two territorial governments were vying for control of the territory, a pro-slavery government located in the town of Lecompton and a free soil government located in Topeka. The Lecompton government enjoyed official recognition from Washington, D.C., but in reality, Kansas was in a state of chaos. Violent encounters between free soilers and pro-slavery settlers became so frequent the press called the territory Bleeding Kansas. In May 1856, matters came to a head when pro-slavery men burned and looted the town of Lawrence, where many members of the Free State government lived. When John Brown, a radical abolitionist whose spirit burned with an intense hatred of slavery, heard of the attack on Lawrence, he cried out for revenge. Brown had moved to Kansas in the mid-1850s to join several of his sons and fulfill what he believed was his God-given mission to do battle with slaveholders. Okay, and I'm going to skip here. Leading a band of vigilantes to a small town along the banks of Pottawatomie Creek, he hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords. It was the start of his short but bloody career. Bloodshed in Congress. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., on May 19, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a long, dramatic speech about the crime against Kansas. Sumner was a fierce opponent of slavery and one of the few members of Congress who believed firmly in racial equality. In his speech, Sumner attacked the pro-slavery forces and reserved the sharpest criticism for Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. According to a Southern custom, this violation of a gentleman's honor demanded a response. 2 days after Sumner delivers his powerful speech, as he sat down at his desk on the Senate floor, Congressman Preston Brooks, a relative of Butler, entered the chamber and savagely beat Sumner with a metal-tipped cane. The desks in the old Senate chamber were bolted to the floor. Unable to escape, but in terrible pain, Sumner used his knees to wrench his desk from its moorings before collapsing on the floor. The carpet around him was soaked with blood. Sumner nearly died and was not able to return to the Senate for almost 4 years. His empty chair was a constant reminder of the violence that had afflicted the United States. While Southern admirers set new canes to Brooks, Northerners reacted with outrage and disgust. Together, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, and the beating of Senator Sumner brought about a political realignment that had been building for years. And the next day, we'll read about the birth of the Republican Party, but we're going to stop there. Let's go back to that map here for a second and look once again. So we have Utah and New Mexico territory that was open to deciding on slavery as part of the Compromise of 1850. And then we have the Nebraska and Kansas territory that was going to be decided whether to be slave or free by popular sovereignty after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And because they were trying to tip the scales either way, free soilers and pro-slavery, it became Bleeding Kansas. And let's look here at this picture of John Brown again. Pretty famous painting, image of John Brown in his image of Bleeding Kansas. That's John Brown there in the middle, shown as kind of a fiery wild man. And that's kind of a a propaganda piece in a way as how he's being represented there as a fiery wild guy, which is what the picture is supposed to be doing there, showing emotion and stirring up your feelings of this issue. So we're going to stop there for today, or for now, not for today, because you need to still finish this lesson. And one more video and we'll finish up the other activities that completes the 6.01 lesson.